Okay, so welcome everyone who has joined us. My name is Gustav Tungren, and on behalf of the Earth System Governance Project, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this fourth ESG speaker series of 2021. Today's session is titled Alternative Actions, Climate Activism and Earth System Governance. If this is the first time that you engage with the Earth System Governance Project, let me provide a brief introduction. We are the largest social science research network in the area of governance and global environmental change. We are a pluralistic and vibrant research community that encourages collaborations among a network of scholars and hosts a stimulating annual conference each year, this year virtually through the 2021 Bratislava Conference on Earth System Governance. If you're engaged in similar research, I encourage you to consider applying to become a research fellow. And we organized this ESG speaker series to provide a platform for the ongoing research discussions and output from scholars of the Earth System Governance Project. Fellows of the network propose the topics and lead the dialogue of the series. Today, we turn our attention to the agency and politics of Earth System Governance. So the world is, of course, quickly running out of time to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and in order to avoid future catastrophic climate scenarios. This unparalleled urgency to take climate action has prompted increasing outspoken ambitions and commitments from both state and non-state actors in global climate governance. However, while goals have been stipulated and ambitions have been heightened, the observed increased greenhouse gas levels showcase an enormous gap between climate ambitions and that of action. It likewise highlights a blatant failure of current global climate policies. And against this backdrop, we have seen new vocal actors in climate activism emerge, and likewise new alternative forms of social activism. This is the topic of today's webinar, and we will run this webinar via two speaker presentations before we conclude with the Q&A discussions together with the audience. I am therefore excited to introduce our moderator, Amandine Orsini of the Université Saint-Louis, Brussels. Amandine is a professor of international politics and has been the driving force in organizing this webinar. Amandine will be joined by two distinguished speakers. First, we have Dr. Jennifer Allen, who is a researcher at Cardiff University and likewise contributed to the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. Her research explores environmental and social movements and how global rules are made and remade. She has recently published a book titled The New Climate Activism, NGO Authority and Participation in Global Climate Governance. Our second speaker is Jos de Moor, postdoctoral researcher at Leiden University. His research relates to global transformations and governance challenges, and he has recently authored the articles Alternative Globalites, Climate Cessation Processes and the Climate Movement Beyond the COPs, as well as the article New Kids on the Block, taking stock of the recent cycle of climate activism. Before we begin, I would just like to make some notes on our housekeeping today. So as an attendee, you're probably aware already that only panelists, chair and moderators, videos and audios are available. The Q&A and chat functions are enabled and open to all. If you wish to ask a question to the speakers, we ask you to please use the Q&A button in the lower section of the screen. If you wish to direct a question at one speaker in particular, you can write their name ahead of the question. If you like someone else's question, you can also upvote this question of another audience member. Finally, there will be an informal Zoom get-together after the webinar for those who wish to discuss climate activism and further connect with the Earth System Governance Project. We will post a link towards the end of the webinars if you're interested to join us there. I will now pass it over to Amandine, who will lead this session from here. Amandine, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Gustav. Welcome, everyone. I'm really pleased and honored to moderate this Earth System Governance Speakers Series event. I just wanted to say a few words about why we organized the event. I must say that was mostly for my own research interests. I am starting a project on use in global environmental politics. And because I'm starting the project, I started to do the literature review. And while looking for references, I actually bought the book by Jennifer on climate activism, because I thought that was a key reference for my research. And searching for more references, I ended up finding all the articles, from Joost. Actually, in the real world, I never met them. I've never seen Joost. I have never seen Jennifer, which is also, I guess, related to the specific circumstances we are in today with all these conferences that have to take place online. And because I was so interested in their work and we never had the opportunity to actually meet and discuss, I thought I would try to organize this session. Obviously, it's not just for my own research interests, but it's also because participating to the Earth System Governance Network for more than 10 years now, I also knew that there were a number of questions about activism that could be relevant for the network. I'm interested in use, but I'm also interested in broader questions like, do recent mobilization of young people and or activists, are they really new or not? In the case of youth, a number of well-established environmental NGOs are also claiming to represent youth, and they have been around for quite some time. And then the other thing is that for my research, I am interested in activists, but I'm also interested in how they interact with institutions. As you probably know, the Earth System Governance Network is particularly interested in the interactions between agents and institutions. And in my case, it's also about understanding if the way all these actors participate to formal governance processes explains how they can also engage maybe in informal actions. So one of my other underlying questions was, do mobilization reinforce Earth System governance institutions and how they actually interact with these institutions? I also, we briefly prepared, obviously, well, briefly, we prepared the seminar, and we have a number of other overarching questions. We're going to mostly talk about climate activism, but we also are happy to broaden the discussion to other topics. Actually, one of our questions was also about, is climate activism specific, or is activism on other environmental issues similar? And then we also had questions about the use specificity. But before going to the discussion, I'm really happy, and I really would like to thank Joost and Jennifer for accepting the invitation, the Earth System Governance Network for accepting to support the event. And again, I feel really honored to see all my research literature coming into this interesting event and discussion today. Thank you very much. And Jennifer, you have the floor.
Thank you, Amandine, and thank you. It's strange to see sort of the book in the wilds, it's thank you for that. Good morning, everyone. Having a quick look at the participant list. Also, good evening for some of you, so thank you. I've been asked to speak for a few minutes, and spoiler alert, this is pretty close to the book. So I'll just share my screen quickly. Okay, hope that worked. Surprise, surprise, it's called The New Climate Activism. Now, I chose this photo for a reason. This is from the Madrid COP, So the last climate meeting that we had in December 2019, and there was a large mobilization where security ended up pushing activists out of the venue because they basically occupied a major space in the venue. And these were youth activists and Indigenous rights activists, and they were making claims for incorporating Indigenous rights in meaningful ways and for intergenerational justice. Climate Action Network said that they organized this protest because they were calling it the pay up and step up, or step up to pay up. It was all about climate finance and meeting goals about climate finance. But there were no signs or no chance about climate finance or stepping up or paying up at this conference. So it sort of encapsulates, I think, for me, the divisions in what we're calling climate activism or activism at climate meetings, and the various claims that are being made and kind of the tensions as these groups try to cooperate or maybe compete with one another. Oh no, this is where you have to work. There we go. Whew. So traditionally, and this is going to be a very broad brush of the literature, we tend to focus on questions around influence. How do we know if NGOs influence global governance? And it's a fascinating question, and it's a methodologically tricky question. And of course, it's very important. Why else are they there if not to influence? We tend to focus on expertise because that's traditionally what a lot of environmental NGOs have focused on, is being those experts in the room to help with the tricky technical bits or providing capacity for some countries' delegations. We tend to focus on environmental NGOs at environmental meetings, and a lot of them are based in the global north. Your WWFs, your environmental defense funds, IUCN to some extent. And so we have a very particular view of NGO activity at global climate meetings. And I'd probably say it's beyond climate. But it actually looks a little more like this. And apologies for a giant graph being sprung on you at this time of the morning or evening. But this is a database I built where it's all the NGOs that have ever participated in a global climate COP. So from 1995 to 2015, these are the ones that showed up, not the ones that registered, not the ones that had permission to attend, but the ones that actually physically traveled to the place the meeting was happening and scanned their badge and went in the door. So the blue line at the top is environmental NGOs, your WWFs, for example. The yellow line is the one I'm interested in. Because you can see there's a dramatic rise around 2006, 2007. And these are social NGOs or social movements. They're making claims around Indigenous rights, youth, gender, labor. A lot of development NGOs are in there. So they're bringing non-environmental issues, and they had no expertise in climate change even, but they started showing up at these climate meetings. You can see economic interests, fairly stable. Climate-specific NGOs, really there's been an increase, but not a huge one. And that traditional other category is mostly cities, parliamentarians, groups like that. But these social NGOs, you see this huge increase. And at times they're almost rivaling environmental NGOs' participation. So when environmental NGOs kind of had this dip after a failed attempt at a treaty in 2009, social movements didn't fall as much and then bounced back quite quickly. So it's an interesting group in terms of their engagement with the climate process. Why would these non-climate NGOs show up? They have no expertise in the issue, which is what we expect that they would have, because that's what we usually tend to look at. They had no experience in sort of this very specific institutions around climate change. These meetings are also social environments with certain practices and ways of interacting. They had no experience there. And then even after 2009, when there was a failure, they stayed. So that was the focus of my research, is this group specifically. So I focused in on 5 cases. For those of you doing a PhD, don't do 5 cases. So 3 of them, labor, gender, and the justice movement, or sometimes called the ultra-global anti-globalization movement, they're the ones that are sort of the new climate activists. They made it. They were motivated to attend. They managed to become recognized by states, some cases in treaty text or decision text, and by other activists as sort of legitimate players in the climate space. Others struggled. So health and human rights never really got that traction. Human rights, the main actors like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they weren't that interested until very recently, actually. And health NGOs, they never really got mobilized within the climate space. So that's sort of the main questions that I'm interested in. Why do this? And why were some successful when others weren't? So why? I have to admit, I thought it was going to be all about money and funding, and I found very little evidence of that. It helped for some actors if they could get a little bit of climate funding, but actually they didn't know who to approach for climate funding. Again, they're totally new in the climate space, and donors that were looking to give out money related to climate change work, they were a bit skeptical about why would they work with this development NGO, or why would they work with a human rights organization on climate change? Because they hadn't really been accepted as sort of a legitimate actor. So the largest reason was to be relevant, to maintain their relevance in global governance. We're also thinking mid-2000s. So this is when the WTO was stalled. The follow-up like Doha round negotiations, conversations on agriculture where, especially justice activists were really invested. Those had all really stalled out. And so the labor movement suddenly found that it had a bit more time on its hands. And the justice movement realized that a lot of their terms have been co-opted. And so, as one person put it to Jennifer Hayden, who's done great work in this area, they were a movement without a cause anymore in terms of fighting against the negative aspects of globalization. But there was a cause that needed a movement, and for them that was climate change. So it was about continuing to push their issues in a new area of global governance, because where they were stalled out. And this makes sense on the flip side if you think about, say, Amnesty International and human rights. They're still incredibly influential. They have all the connections they need, and it's still a fruitful sort of continuing to progress area of global governance where there's a lot of work to be done. And so they're quite happy where they are. Why would they seek to branch out? Of course, there's a normative commitment. The climate crisis is real. The IPCC report was discussed often. But at the end of the day, we can all care about the climate crisis, but that wasn't enough to actually get them to start showing up. So how did this work? They're motivated, they're showing up. Why were some successful and others weren't? So there's 3 things I'll quickly highlight. One is cohesion amongst the NGOs and the activists that are showing up at these conferences, that they can rally around the same frame. So it's not really enough to say climate change is a gender issue. You have to really specifically say what that might mean. So for some, it was around controlling population. There was even a conversation around population offsets, which led that group to be vetted out entirely by the other actors working on gender climate, because they were highlighting disproportionate effects. So this was sort of the ability to have a single voice and a single frame was really important. Having a broker or an ally, so someone embedded in the climate process, recognized in the climate process, who would help. And essentially in a social environment like these meetings are, they were saying, look, they're with me, therefore they're one of us. So that was extremely helpful, and really no broker, they weren't successful. The last one that I'll quickly highlight is linking that frame whether it's gender or labor or justice, to a specific area of the negotiations, a specific discursive hook, because negotiators work in siloed issue areas. If you walk up to them and say, hey, this is important for health, they don't know what to do with that information. Where should they take that and write it in a text? Where should they insert that into the complex landscape of climate? So linking it to a very specific set of institutions was very important. And learning to leverage procedural rules. So one procedural rule is getting constituency status. So labor and gender they did. Justice ended up splitting the environmental NGO constituency. There's all sorts of benefits of being a constituent or a constituency. You get workshop invites, extra information, you can meet with the presiding officers, you get to speak in plenary. And Climate Justice Now showed up and said, look, Climate Action Network doesn't represent us. They don't represent most environmental NGOs, only about 10%, 11%. So we're going to split these benefits down the middle. And there was no love lost between Climate Action Network and Climate Justice Now over this, because they disagreed on most issues, although they're a little bit closer, I think, now than maybe they admit. But leveraging these procedural rules, getting recognition in any way that they could through the formal processes was really important. And it was an area where health really struggled and human rights hadn't showed up yet, really. So sort of an implication of this is whenever the rules change, say a new issue is developed, that could actually trigger new claims to be linked to a global body. So whenever we see expansion of rules, we might see an expansion of civil society presence. So thank you very much. I know that was a bit of a whirlwind, but I think hopefully there's enough there for an interesting conversation afterwards. And I definitely didn't want to take too much of Joost's time. I hope I didn't.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jennifer. As announced, we prefer to have both presentations and then go to the discussion. So I'm happy to give the floor to Joost de Moor.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, Amandine, for organizing this and for inviting me to participate. I'll first move on to sharing my screen, which for some reason doesn't show show all windows. Just need a second because somehow when I try to share my screen, it doesn't show the option of sharing my PowerPoint.
Okay, we will try to see if we can help this. Joost, just hold on a second.
Yeah, I think it's basically because I have too many windows open on my computer, so it doesn't really know which one to share. It should be resolved in a second or two. Sorry to keep you waiting. Yeah, there we go. Okay, hope you'll be able to see my screen now.
Yes.
So I'll be talking a bit about the question of what is actually new about the recent waves of climate activism. And I'm mainly talking about Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion then, which of course is not the entire climate movement. I mean, listening to Jen, of course, it's clear that the climate movement is an increasingly diverse movement, but often when we talk about climate activism, we talk about these groups primarily based in the global north, like the youth taking the streets to demand climate action. So I'll be talking about climate activism in that more narrow sense, and I'll be reflecting on what is actually new about that, and perhaps also, most importantly, whether and why those new elements might matter for our understanding of climate activism, but in particularly also Earth system governance more broadly, as I'll try to argue. So I'll briefly talk about the newness in terms of who is participating in these events, as well as elements of continuity. I'll be talking about how and why they participate and what is new about that. And there I'll focus in particular on an apparent recentering of the state in climate activism in the most recent waves of mobilization. And I'll conclude with an argument that this recentering of the state allows us to move towards a new understanding of the state in the Anthropocene. I'll be talking about some statistics, some numbers, and most of these statistics come from these two reports. So in the course of 2019, together with, I think, more than 100 colleagues worldwide, we organized many protest surveys of predominantly Fridays for Future, but our British colleagues also organized several protest surveys of Extinction Rebellion. And I won't bore you with the methodological details. Suffice to say that we used a method that is designed to get a representative sample of people participating in the protests that we surveyed. And so that allows us to say something about who the typical characteristics of who is participating, what they want, what motivates them, etc. So if you're interested to know more about that, then please look up these reports. I'm also happy to share them with you. They're available open access, both of them. So moving on just to some basic descriptions of who is participating. And the first thing that in public discussions of the new climate activism, and in particular, of course, Fridays for Future, has been gender. Of course, Greta Thunberg's leadership has raised discussions about how this is a movement led by women, particularly young women, of course. And when we looked at who was participating, we by and large also confirmed that women were more likely to participate in these protests. But there is quite a bit of difference also you see here in this graph of the distribution. So in Helsinki, for instance, almost 3/4 of the participants identified as women, whereas in Brussels and Chemnitz, actually it was less than half. But overall, we find that women were overrepresented, which is by and large not very surprising. It is in line with other research showing, for instance, that women score higher on concern about the environment. Slightly more surprising, or perhaps more new, is the age distribution, which won't come as a surprise. Of course, especially in the case of Fridays for Future, one of the most visible characteristics was the large part of participation of teenagers and young people more generally, especially also in leadership functions. But as this graph shows, indeed, all the green are young people, the dark green are actually teenagers, which, for instance, in the city of Warsaw, where we did a survey, made up as much as 3/4 of the participants. Again, we see some important difference between the cities, but overall, it won't come as a surprise that young people participated quite extensively. Interestingly, these are actually the data from September, and we did our survey both in September and in March. And in September, the movement had actually become a bit broader, had focused on mobilizing other generations as well, arguing that, of course, older generations also have a responsibility to participate in demanding climate action. And so actually, when you look at the data from March, the participation of young cohorts is even more overwhelming than in this graph. The final sort of new element that stands out and that we also find in our data is that many of the people participating in these recent waves of climate activism were doing so for the first time. So when we interviewed participants, I think in March, we found that 38% of them were protesting for the very first time in their entire lives. Similar studies using the same method on a more general set of demonstrations finds that 10% is actually typical, 10% first timers. So we do confirm that actually these demonstrations are able to mobilize many new people into climate politics or politics more generally, actually. We also see that these people haven't been embedded in the typical environmental movement networks. Only 10% of them were a member of environmental movement organizations, and that those were particularly the older people participating, and only 8% was recruited by an environmental movement organization. And on the figure on the right, we see actually that online social media and friends were by and far the most important factor in bringing people to the street. So we have young people, we have newcomers, and we have more female participation than male participation. But there is an elephant in the room. There is many newcomers, but the social strata that these newcomers are being mobilized from seem to be still the same as we know have delivered environmental and climate protesters for a long time. Namely, they are in particular the highly educated and all the sort of socio-demographic characteristics that come with them. So there's new people participating, but they still represent the same parts of the population. So a continuing problem for the climate movement then is, of course, to reach beyond those constituencies. Moving on to sort of how and why they participated, of course, some of the most iconic parts of these new waves of climate activism were the tactics of school strikes in the case of Fridays for Future, and mass civil disobedience in the case of Extinction Rebellion. We actually do find the use of these tactics already in the past, but their sort of massive employment was, of course, new. Something that is, for me, the most striking part, of course, because of my sort of personal research interests, is the return of the state. We see, for instance, in the demands of Extinction Rebellion, that they are very clearly oriented towards governments. And in the case of Fridays for Future, we see the same. As such, that might not be so surprising. We know that social movements have long targeted the state to make their demands. Social movements have actually historically emerged hand in hand with the state. But if we look at the recent history of climate activism, it is actually somewhat surprising, where actually in recent years, we saw the emergence of a kind of do-it-yourself climate activism in response to the apparent inability of states and international government organizations to do something about climate change. So, for instance, one of the most visible recent campaigns was the End the Galende campaign in Germany, a direct action campaign against lignite coal mining, where the organizers explained what they had been doing using the following explanation. So at Pentecost 2016, End the Galende went to Lusatia with nearly 4,000 people to block lignite mining infrastructure and to show that we are the investment risk. So clearly, they're directly targeting economic actors and bypassing the state. We see something similar with the spread of sort of everyday alternative forms of action, alternative modes of consumption, of production, where also people are often motivated to take matters into their own hands in their everyday life because they don't feel like the state is going to take care of the problem for them. This might make us wonder or assume that perhaps somehow these newcomers naively believe when they return to the state that the state can solve this problem for them. Perhaps they haven't been disillusioned yet about the state and international government organizations' ability to address this problem. But this doesn't seem to be the case. Actually, we see that very few participants, especially the older ones, felt hopeful about policies being able to change, to address climate change. And only 9% of the respondents agreed that governments can be relied on to solve our environmental problems. So there seems to be still, despite the return to the state, a widespread skepticism about the likeliness of the state addressing this problem, at least on its own. So what we might be seeing is sort of the emergence of a more moralistic activism, one that doesn't care so much about whether a certain strategy is actually very effective, but actually focuses especially on who has the moral responsibility to act. And it calls on governments to live up to that moral responsibility, for instance, in the famous "How dare you" speech by Greta Thunberg, but also in this common narrative in Extinction Rebellion, where people seem to be motivated by a desire to be able to look my grandchildren in the eye. I will finally reflect briefly on sort of what the consequences of this return to the state might be. And in doing so, I would like to go beyond the question of influence, because I think this return to the state is perhaps not that likely to radically change state policy. I would actually like to focus on the possibility that this return to the state, or more generally, this move away and back to the state, might actually change the function or the shape of the state and of environmental governance more generally, where, of course, one could argue, well, maybe that overestimates the power of environmental and climate movements a bit. If we start wondering whether they might actually change the very state, that strong institution itself. But it is actually when we start de-thingifying the state, when we start seeing it as a set of relations, as an idea, that we can start imagining that actually civil society plays an important role in creating those relations and that story about the state. And of course, Antonio Gramsci has been one of the main proponents of that idea of the state as not as a thing, but as a set of relations that also requires a story that sort of legitimizes why certain groups in society have power over other groups in society. And it is actually in going into the Anthropocene that story might be changing, and climate movements might be at the forefront of changing that story. So in what ways might the new climate activism actually be recreating the state? So when we look, for instance, at this kind of DIY environmentalism, where activists take matters into their own hands, we could say, well, we see an emergence of a kind of anarchy that puts the state to one side. Or we might say it reinforces a kind of neoliberalism where citizens are expected to take care of problems themselves. When we look at Fridays for Future with their claims of that governments should listen to the science and saying that it is not our responsibility to tell you how you should solve the problem, saying instead that the state should find out how climate problems can be addressed, we see a very different image of the state emerging, a kind of minimalist representative democracy, or even what some might call a climate leviathan. Extinction Rebellion is a bit more ambiguous, claiming that they have ended the social contract, demanding state action and a strong government, while also claiming extended citizen participation. So they bring in sort of a hybrid of a kind of climate leviathan combined with a deliberative democracy. So to wrap things up, I think that there is both elements of newness and continuity, especially when we look at how who participates and how in the new climate activism. One of the most interesting things for me is that the state plays this changing role in climate activism from centering to decentering and recentering. And I think that a de-thingified relational view of the state, by extension of international government organizations, allows us to see how the state may change as a result of this activism. So thereby climate activism isn't only something that is interesting for social movement scholars or people who have sort of a sympathy for the movement, but also it becomes climate activism becomes these sites where Earth system government scholars more generally could observe how the state and international government organizations, as well as citizenship, are reimagined, redone, and therefore actually remade going into the Anthropocene. So that is my invitation to the community in terms of a sort of a research agenda. So thank you for your attention. I hope I haven't spoken too long.
Thank you very much, Joost. No, that was perfect. So as planned, we now move on to the Q&A session, and our intention is really to have all attendees participating. So I remind you that you have the Q&A chat if you want to ask questions. I have questions myself, but I prefer to look at these Q&A, and I already see one question, a very interesting question about change. One of us is asking, is there much evidence for activists changing their fundamental positions in response to new and contradictory empirical research? Or alternatively, do their institutional roles and cohesion make it harder to change positions? So Jennifer, you've been talking about new groups coming to the climate change negotiations. Joost, you also have indicated elements on this. So the question is really about change. Is change of their message easy, and how does it happen? Jennifer, maybe, Jennifer, maybe if you want to start answering the question.
Sure, and it's, excuse me, it's a very good one. So in terms of changing in light of new evidence, Not a lot, just because sort of the evidence from the IPCC has been pretty clear since 2007, at least, if not longer. But the second question, maybe I'll focus more on in terms of harder to change positions. Because what I've seen in my work is that it's the mainstream climate movement that's changed in response to all these new claims brought by all these new actors. So Climate Action Network is much more comfortable with justice-based language than it ever has been before. It's also much more comfortable with things like protest tactics than it ever has been before. And so a lot of the change has actually been by the mainstream reacting to a lot of the things that used just raised, but a lot of these new claims. The other sort of mechanism of change, which isn't perhaps positive, is co-optation. And so it's something I'm working on a bit now, is what has happened to all these frames and new ideas that these new activists brought, like a just transition came from the labor movement. They've been using that term since the 90s. Or, things like co-benefits of health or gender justice. Climate justice does not mean what the justice movement meant in 2007. Now it means something completely different. And so that's been another mechanism of change, which actually isn't related to the activists or their institutional role, other than that they are new and perhaps a bit more marginalized. And so others can use their words and change the meanings.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead, please.
Joost, on change.
Yeah, thank you for that very interesting question. And I now really need to make sure that I don't start talking very long, because I think this question is one that I've been trying to deal with for a long time, especially in light of this question of contradictory evidence. I think an importantly but largely overlooked question is how climate movement activists actually make sense of the climate crisis. At first sight, it seems to be quite an obvious crisis. There is too much CO2 or other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that increases the temperature, and we need to get fewer greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But actually, sort of diagnosing climate change is much more complicated, especially once, as we see increasingly, this question of whether it is too late to prevent dangerous climate change starts becoming more and more central as we run out of time to actually prevent that. And of course, as someone trying to navigate climate science, anyone who's tried to do that knows that there's a lot of contradictory evidence, especially around that question of whether we are past that point of whether it is too late or not. And it seems like climate activists are struggling with that question as well, which in turn has quite a substantial influence or could have on their position. So we see, for instance, the emergence of some people who are engaging in what some have called a post-apocalyptic activism, who are radically adopting the position, it is too late to change this. Our activism should become about dealing with the consequences of this problem, because we will not be solving it anyway. Other groups like the ones I've been talking about now, Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion, seem to be taking a bit more of an ambiguous position on it. In principle, their demands stay quite well embedded in the framework of still solving this problem, or at least keeping it to within quote unquote safe boundaries. So their demands stay quite focused on mitigation, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But their narrative actually starts sounding quite a lot like that post-apocalyptic narrative, in saying things like our house is on fire, and excuse my French, but Extinction Rebellion has often said, we are fucked, is this famous banner drop that they've done. There seems to be sneaking in this kind of post-apocalyptic one. But overall, there seems to be also a lot of resistance against this kind of framing, where even though activists feel like it might be too late, it's sort of forbidden to say that. We have to, give whichever odds we have left, we have to keep fighting for mitigation, and therefore they actually resist changing position in light of contradictory elements. So that's just my take on that question, if I understood it correctly.
Perfect. Then I see we have at least two questions with regards to the geography of climate activism. One is really about if you have an idea or could give us an idea of the geographic representation in the new climate activism. And the other is about the global north and global south. So just someone asking you if you have any data on the global south and how climate activism changed in the global south. So maybe Joost, you can start, and then Jennifer.
Yeah. So unfortunately, our data is or at least the data that I've presented now is quite restricted to the global north. I mean, strictly speaking, Sydney is of course in the global south, but we understand it as part of the global north typically. And that we have made efforts to get teams to do the same surveys in the global south. We were very close to having the survey being done in South Africa, India, Chile, but for basic practical reasons, in the end, those teams were not able to go out into the streets. And so our data, unfortunately, even though Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion both had important mobilizations, especially in those countries that I've mentioned, we don't really have much data on that. So I'm afraid I can't really say something about the change there from that quantitative point of view. Of course, there's a lot of qualitative research on environmental activism in the global south, which shows, for instance, that questions of adaptation are much more important in activism there. Questions of environmental justices are much more important there. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Jennifer, anything on the geographical representation of climate activism in your case?
Yeah, it's one thing that's very striking about several of the groups bringing new claims about these social movements is a lot of them have strong basis in the global south. So especially the climate justice movement, when it first formed, was spearheaded by organizations like Focus on the Global South. Now Jubilee is heavily involved. So that's really been one of the main sort of sources of legitimacy for their claims, and for them saying part of their aim is to help bring activists from the global south into these global processes, because otherwise they've been traditionally absolutely absent. So there's been quite an increase in that. I wouldn't say it's even across all of the new climate activists at all, but some of these networks have had a lot of focus on improving representation by activists from the global south.
Thank you. Then I can also see a set of questions more about the relation between climate activism and more traditional political organizations. So for instance, someone is asking about political parties. Do these groups also link to political parties? And then someone, as a follow-up to the question on change, is asking if the position of these groups explain why groups such as Extinction Rebellion struggle to attract mainstream political support. And then related to this, there is also one interesting question about if you see any dynamics of states trying to limit the space of civil society actors on these issues, even if it's a little different. So link of the movement and activists to more traditional political structures, political parties, mainstream government support. And then this question of, on the other hand, is also the state trying to limit and control the space of the movement. Jennifer?
Sure, I'll give it a go. It's an interesting question, I think, especially if we think about the architecture of the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement relocates the action to the national level. So there's not a lot for the international level to do. anymore. We get reports, we see if those reports are okay, we do a global stock take. But those nationally determined contributions, the pledges, are all entirely determined at the national level. So activism, I think, is going to move much more nationally. And I think, Jos just showed that quite strongly. And so I haven't seen a lot in my work, at least, about linking to political parties, for example. Some of the women's rights activists also had a history in anti-nuclear type work. And so they were linked into some green parties in Europe, especially Germany. But that was about it. And so I think the question now is, which of these movements are going to start working with governments and which will be targeting governments? And how is that going to go? In terms of limiting CSO space globally, I think we've seen the opposite. In Madrid, 9,000 NGO badges were given out. No, sorry, 9,000 government badges were given out. 11,000 observer badges were given out. So that's part of the push, even to have COP26 totally in person, is that I think it's seen as a way of the international process keeping some relevance and some legitimacy, that even though they don't actually have a lot to do anymore, they can bring all of these non-state actors together. So it's sort of maybe even a shift towards convening non-state actors in a way, or orchestrating them, as others have put. But yeah, Joost, you probably have much more to say on this than I do.
Thank you, Jennifer. Joost?
Yeah, so that's an interesting set of questions. I'll take them in the order. So parties first, I think. So I'll stick with Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion to answer the question. I think both of them have been quite cautious to not become affiliated with political parties, each in slightly different ways. So much of discussions around Fridays for Future has, of course, been around how the movement has been quite depoliticized, and much of its theory of change is built on the desire to become the biggest movement possible. And there is this notion that as soon as political affiliations or political statements become too pronounced, then that would damage that ability to mobilize the masses. And so Fridays for Future, even though various political parties have, of course, especially green parties, have, of course, made efforts to demonstrate themselves as close allies, I think the group itself has tried to keep its distance. There has been an interesting case, I think, with Extinction Rebellion in the UK around the last national elections, where parts of Extinction Rebellion UK were arguing that it should endorse the Labour campaign, even if Labour has limited, or there's limits to its climate policies as well. Arguably, they were saying, well, it's better than Conservative, so we should rally behind Labour. But ultimately, it chose not to do that, much to the dismay of the more sort of left-wing oriented part of that movement. So by and large, I think the groups have kept a distance, even though, of course, they've tried to make influence on political parties. But that sort of brings me to the question of positions and support as well, I think, where I think both in Fridays for Future as well as Extinction Rebellion, there has been this theory of change of the bigger we are, the more influential we are, which has motivated them to tone down their political messaging. And that, I think, is how they see that relation between political positions and support. But of course, it has been internally criticized, and there is important differences between groups and countries. So we see, for instance, that in Germany, Fridays for Future seems to have a much more politicized outlook, has more pronounced links also with more radical climate groups, whereas in other countries, Fridays for Future has remained more distant and has tried to stay more politically neutral. Extinction Rebellion, of course, has actually from the beginning been very engaged in questions of diversity. For instance, around discussions when Extinction Rebellion tried to approach the police in a very friendly way, saying, the police, you are on our side, we are both trying to protect society. And of course, there were these discussions, around how this alienates people, especially people of color, who have a much more negative experience with the police and who said, well, the police are actually not our friends. And I think you should express solidarity with us. And the fact that you express such friendliness with the police is a sign of your white privilege. And so I think over time, Extinction Rebellion has developed this and has become more mature in recognizing that it cannot but take position on these discussions. And then finally, with regards to sort of whether there is a limiting space for these groups to operate, I think especially Fridays for Future, I think most governments were pretty keen to allow them their space. I think it would have looked very bad on governments if they would have actively repressed this, even though, of course, there were, I think, particularly in Australia, some efforts to sort of really persecute the people who, the youngsters who were skipping school. They were arguing that this was not allowed. In some cases, I think even persecuting their parents. But more importantly, I think there is in many countries ongoing processes of a criminalization of protest, especially in the UK. There's a lot of research on the criminalization of protest. And of course, especially groups like Extinction Rebellion are running into those boundaries of what is allowed in the protest sphere. And I think from that point of view, the space is contracting. We saw that, for instance, also around COP21 in Paris, most famously, when Paris was hit by terrorist attacks 2 weeks before the COP, which in turn led to a state of emergency, which among other things included a ban on protesting. The protesters quite bravely sort of went out to protest anyway, and ultimately few of them were prosecuted for doing so. But I think overall there is quite some worrying trends of the protest space for protest being limited. And with regard to what Jen was saying about the COPs opening up for this, I think, yes, when we look at the number of access cards given out to NGOs, I think this might be the case, but also over time, I think this has been balanced by sort of also increasingly stricter ideas of what NGOs would be allowed to do once they are inside. So I think access is not necessarily allowing groups to do what they want to do. And then especially also the securitization of spaces around COPs furthermore limits possibilities for radical climate action in particular.
Thank you very much. It's also very interesting because Jennifer has more like an insider view and you have more an outsider view. There are many other very interesting questions. We are nearly coming to the end of the event. I'm sorry I cannot do justice to all the questions. I'm trying to group them. I see at least two very important points that you raise in the Q&A. The first is, what is the impact of the COVID-19 situation on climate activism? And the other is about, does all this help solve the climate crisis? So really, you know, the impact on the effectiveness of policy making. I know we don't have the time for you to answer to both questions, but I invite you all to the social event afterwards if you want. And I will still give Jennifer and Joost the opportunity to say a last word. So it can be related to the COVID-19 situation or to the effectiveness of climate action, but just a final word if you want. Jennifer?
Sure. On the effectiveness, I mean, I think we wouldn't be even discussing the idea of justice or a just transition without these social actors showing up. I think they've changed how we view climate change in a very fundamental way. And I think they've expanded the range of actors that see climate change as now part of their work. So we have grandmothers and we have, I think, Queers for Climate, we're out in New York. We have all these actors now that used to never think about climate change as part and parcel of their everyday work that now are. So I think that actually could have a material effect. In terms of COVID, we're all waiting to see what happens. That's the thing with these activists that want to become insiders, is now there's no meetings. And now whoever gets that link to the Zoom discussion is who's included in a given negotiation. So I think it's been really tough days for insiders.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yours, the final word before we give back the floor to Gustav.
Yeah, I hope to continue this with many of you in the social event afterwards. But maybe on the COVID discussion, we've been interviewing activists in Sweden and Finland about how they've been coping with the COVID-19 situation. We know, of course, that it has led to a massive demobilization for obvious reasons. But we also find that many activists are able to keep active, especially through online forms of protest. But actually, I think about 15% of the people we interviewed also found ways to somehow do still offline protest. So that's optimistic. A slightly pessimistic note is that it seems to be especially the most experienced, the most embedded activists who are able to do that. So even though the Fridays for Future movement brought a lot of newcomers into the movement, it's those newcomers who are the first to fall out once the going gets tough. And so that's a bit sad, of course. But this is research in development, so take my comments on that with a grain of salt.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I give the floor now then back to Gustav from the ESG network to conclude the session. And thank you very much for the interesting presentations and discussion.
Thank you, Amandine, and thank you,